Well, it is my great pleasure to have Dr. Edward L. Branch, the pastor of Third New Hope Baptist Church of Detroit, Michigan, a fabulous preacher and just a great soul and a great friend to me. And it's so great to have you to be with us today. Just fabulous to have you.
It's wonderful to be here. I'm honored. I really am. I'm honored to be invited.
Well, thank you, sir. Thanks. We're honored to have you. So a lot of people who, of course, watch this video will know who Edward L. Branch is. What would you like the audience that is just getting to know you, maybe the 2 or 3 people that don't know you, what would you like to?
Well, the thing is, after this many years, on the road, I think that a certain amount of it, your consistency and faithfulness and all of that, kind of speaks for itself, and I think that for me, I just want people to know I've been on the road a while, and that I intend to stay on this road because I believe in it.
Yes. So where'd you grow up?
Well, I actually grew up in Chicago. I was born and raised there for the most part. I'm the 11th of 13 of us, and the first of my parents' children that were born in Chicago. But we were back and forth from Chicago to Mississippi a lot, which is where my parents were from, and where they moved back to in my teenage years. And so I got a chance to actually live in Mississippi, in the country, way out in the country. No electricity, no running water, and all of that. That came along later. But it was a good life, and I've learned, as life continues, I've learned to appreciate it. Oh, yeah.
So tell me about, your call to preach.
Well, that's interesting. During my early years, even as a child, as a preteen, I used to imitate a preacher named J.H. Lane. His name was John Henry Lane, out of Mississippi. But he was in Chicago, and he would preach revival for the church that I grew up in. And
Which church?
This is New Mount Sinai Baptist Church in Chicago, on the west side. And so out of that, playing church, pretending to be J.H. Lane and all of that, I guess I did zero in on a sense of call. And in my mid-teens, I started, seeking the Lord about it and kind of asking, hey, is this something that you're calling me to do? And if so, give me some signs and all of that. And everything I would pray for, the Lord would answer. And so in my mid-teens, 15, 16 years old, I knew then that there was a call of God upon my life for the preaching ministry. Okay.
So where were you licensed?
I was licensed at New Mount Sinai in Chicago in 1973. That was a time, in my life that I really, found myself more anchored in the life of the church and growing in my understanding of ministry and of the Lord, and was licensed by the late Elijah Searcy and the New Mount Sinai Baptist Church.
So tell me, from there to pastoring, so how did you get from there to being pastor?
Well, once I was licensed in ministry, I had been serving all along as the organist for New Mount Sinai. I played, the organ every Sunday and all of that, and taught the choir and so forth. And so it just continued to grow in terms of ministerial responsibilities, and I started to preach, around. I was involved with the District Association and the State Convention and the National Baptist Convention of America at that time. And so there was a little bit of exposure for me, especially as a young preacher coming along. And so I had opportunities to preach, many youth days. And I say that with a grin because, it's been a long time since I preached a youth day. But, back then. And so I got married at 20 years old. And after I got married, we moved to Detroit to assist a pastor, a friend of mine who was called to a church there. We were intending to just go there for a little while to help out. And it did turn out to be a short while as far as working with that church and that pastor, but it was bigger and broader for us in ministry in Detroit. So that after I joined the New Bethel Baptist Church, it was just a matter of months before I was called to Third New Hope.
Okay, so you went to Detroit to assist at New Bethel?
No, I went to Detroit to assist at New Jerusalem.
Okay.
Baptist Church.
So how did you get from New Jerusalem to New Bethel?
Well, I left New Jerusalem after approximately 6 or 8 months and joined New Bethel Baptist Church.
Okay.
From going there, I mean, even before Detroit, I knew of Reverend Franklin and had, wanted to meet him and all the rest. And so I got the privilege of meeting, this larger-than-life character and tremendous preacher. Everything that I had heard and known and in his recordings, I received about him, was true and better than true. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I joined New Bethel Church, and he just immediately embraced me in, and we started doing ministry there. And I occasionally, played the organ there, and engaged in other areas of ministry at New Bethel, mm-hmm. Until I went to Third New Hope.
And there may be some people that do not know that you're talking about Reverend C.L. Franklin.
Yes.
So, and even for our international audience, that's Aretha Franklin's father. Because our international, most of our national audience would know.
Right. It started out, of course, with Miss Aretha being Reverend Franklin's daughter. But with her fame, of course, in music and all the rest, the tremendously gifted person that she is, it soon became that, Reverend Franklin is Aretha Franklin's daddy. So yeah, that was my mentor and pastor.
So because, in a lot of our estimation, he is probably the most imitated preacher in African American history. And because you are so close to him, I think I would like to know, and our audience would like to know, what reflections would you share about him? Because, some of us, we don't want to lose. And you've done a wonderful job. You did 3 years with the C.L. Franklin Conference, so I know you don't want to lose that either. So I'm going to open up a space for you to say whatever you'd like to say, because from not just having read about it, or heard about it, you were there. So
yeah, well, Reverend Franklin, of course, as I stated, larger than life personality to me, and for me to meet him was phenomenal. But then to do ministry with him, just took things over the top. Shortly after joining New Bethel, he called me and invited me to preach on a Sunday morning. And it just totally blew me. I mean, for him to even call me, was one thing, but to be invited to New Bethel Baptist Church to preach, with him sitting there, that was phenomenal. But here's the thing, numbers of folk who had met him and who had interacted with him, had told me what to expect, that he would never notice me, that he was too busy, that he had so much going on that I would, just wouldn't even be a blip on the radar to him. But it turned out to be otherwise. He not only noticed me, but he invited me to participate in ministry. He invited me to preach. He complimented my preaching. And at that time, I didn't even walk to the pulpit with any meaningful level of confidence, but afterwards, hearing a person of his skill and his stature say such meaningful, encouraging words, it was a turning point, for me in my life in ministry. And so, I celebrate him even to this day, and I know that there's much of him that's in me because I paid close attention to him. I watched his every move. I listened to his every word. I mean, it was more than just listening to him preach. I watched him walk. I, listened to his preliminaries, the way he formed words, the words he chose to use. And I watched his interaction with people and how his preaching interpreted the times for common people who, for the most part, were only victims of the larger environment and concerns of life, and who could not by any means make sense of much of what was going on politically, socially, and otherwise in our world. But his preaching was something that made sense out of the world for common people. And I mean, and still do today in his recordings, many of which, if it weren't for, a statement or two here or there where he may say what year it is or mention some event that happened, you wouldn't know if he had preached that sermon last Sunday. So I think that his preaching was solid and relevant, and I think that the time came in my life and my ministry to to speak to that, to say that this man of God was used of God in a particular time of history to be an instrument in God's hands for the sake of people, mainly common people. And I think that's important.
You use that word common people several times, so tell me about that. What was the makeup of New Bethel?
Well, that's good. New Bethel at that time, had its, top echelon of people, the politicians that belonged there, the doctors and others. But the bulk of the congregation were what I consider to be, and I use the word common, everyday people, people who get up in the morning and who are working hard out there, many of which are using public transportation to get to work. They are making just above minimum wages in most cases, and they are the ones who I think not only Reverend Franklin's ministry appealed to, but in my reading of Scripture, those are the same folk to whom Jesus appealed. The everyday person. When he says this, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden," it is reaching out to those individuals who are near the bottom rung of the social ladder, who are the marginalized, the rejected in many cases, and those who not only are discounted by society sometimes, but who see themselves as maybe less than what they really are in God. So the everyday common person, and the late Dr. Matt Carter used to say in talking about everyday people, he said, God must love them, he made so many of them.
So what, from your view, made C.L. Franklin, Reverend Franklin, such a phenomenal preacher?
I think internally, I think his own journey, his family life, his upbringing, his environment in Mississippi was a strong part of that. But then also, this man possessed an amazing gift of voice. He had music in his voice, and he was particularly tuned in to what was happening in preaching during his time. I mean, in the books that were written by Nick Salvatore as well as Jeff Tyden, there's so many statements that Reverend Franklin made himself, concerning, how he felt the call of God upon his life, and his own particular experiences. And so when he came on the scene and he used that tremendous gift of voice to preach the good news of the gospel, large numbers of folk were, of course, attracted to him, and he became a preaching phenomenon.
Most people, not all, but a lot of people lock into what Bishop Timothy Clark just said, the last 7 minutes of the sermon, his hooping. But it was so much more than just that. So give us, you were closer. I would say what I think, but it's not important. It's important what you think. You were close. There's so much more than just the hooping going on in that sermon. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, and during his hooping, it was not just a lot of empty words. During his hooping, he was still engaged in that message and was still giving solid information and unfolding scripture, even in his hooping. And, he had the last 7 minutes, but many of his sermons, we could tell by numbers of his recordings, some of them were only 20 minutes, so when you take away that 7 minutes, I mean, you still have a considerable amount of time that he is spending expounding upon Scripture, and he possessed a special gift, a peculiar gift at doing that, as I said earlier, because it was interpreting life and interpreting where his sermons, everything from man on the moon. I mean, this was during the time that, a lot of people, especially African American people, were skeptical about anybody really going to the moon. Announce all of this and show all this on television or whatever, for the community to believe it, is different. But when Reverend Franklin, preached about it and attempted to make more sense of it, then it makes the whole concept more palatable to people. And so I think he had a gift for doing that, so that he helped people understand it on a level that was more digestible for people.
Mm-hmm. So what would be your favorite Reverend Franklin sermon?
Well, it's funny because I asked Reverend Franklin one time, which was his favorite Reverend Franklin sermon, and he said the inner conflict. He said, yeah, I think, if I had to pick one, he says it's hard, but if I had to pick one, it would be the inner conflict. For me, it's actually what is your life? You know, where he deals with from the book of James, but in it he tells the story of Jonah. You know, Jonah running away from God, and he brings it back, and he opens up that passage, and he works through it in a way that helps all of us understand what life is, and our purpose in life, and God's will for our lives. And again, I have to say, it is, for me, one of the greatest examples of his skill at interpreting Scripture and making it applicable to the current situation, and his vocal skills at delivering that word, including the whooping. So he's at his best in that with I think every part of what we refer to as preaching.
So listening to you, voice is very important in preaching, very important in his preaching. So, you know, you've said it several times in just, you know, talking here. So tell me about your sense. What part of the voice is important to preaching? I guess I don't. Yeah.
You know, the thing about it is that when I talk about Reverend C.L. Franklin, I particularly talk about his voice because that was something that was unique for him. And the message, I think, out of that for me was, use the gift that God has given me. He used the gift that God gave him. I must use the gift that God gave me. You must use the gift God gave you. Every preacher must use the gift that God gave them. And I think that when we use our gifts to the best of our ability, employing them, developing them, honing them, that we show our faithfulness to the preaching assignment. So, yeah, voice is important, but I think the individual's voice, you know, so that no one is out here to be someone else, and no one is measured by someone else's gift, only by the gift that God has given them. And so I hold Reverend Franklin in that, because I think it would have been a tragedy had he not used the tremendous voice that he had. But at the same time, no other preacher should attempt to use Reverend Franklin's gift, because that was for Reverend Franklin to do. And I mean, there's been times in my ministry, you know, early on, I would go places and be introduced as, you know, C.L. Franklin's son. You know, I mean, it started as son in the ministry, but after a while, you know, get around, this is a son of C.L. And so people expect me to live up to his standard of preaching and all the rest, you know, to which, you know, I always said, you know, if you give me a chance, I'll be the best E.L. Branch you've ever heard, but I can't be C.L. Franklin.
So what are your gifts in preaching?
Well, I think, you know, as I began to move along and to develop in this thing of ministry and preaching, I began to zero in passionately and otherwise on connecting with people and focusing on building relationships with people and helping people further develop and strengthen relationships they have with others. And so I think that if if I have to answer that question, I would say, hey, my gift is helping people maintain, develop and maintain healthy and wholesome relationships. And I want to do it through preaching, so that if there's anything that would run through all of my sermons and preaching, as a golden thread, that would probably be it. I'm going to say something about us living in this world together, getting along with each other, not being each other's judges, but each other's brothers and sisters.
Yes. So how would you characterize your preaching? Narrative, expository, or neither any of that? How would you characterize it?
Well, we start out early on. You say, okay, we got the narrative, we got the expository, we got the topical and the textual and all that. So I think that I'm much more of a topical preacher, which, of course, that one, of course, is sometimes probably the one that gets the bad name. But I think I'm much more of a topical preacher, but I do it textually and expositorily. I want to always give an exposition of the text. However, I noticed myself in my latter years, and maybe as far as maybe the last 15, 20 years, that I'm doing much more narrating in my sermons as well, as I develop my approach to my topic. So it's a hodgepodge of all of that in there, but I think the dominant thing would still remain that I'm basically a topical preacher.
So I want to ask you to define topical, because topical over here, everybody's got, even expository is 100 definite. Everybody.
Yeah.
So how would you define topical?
Well, topical preaching to me means that the focus, the commitment, and the loyalty of the sermon is on the text, theme, and title. Okay. Probably more so than the exposition of the passage, so that the commitment, so that once I announce what it is I'm talking about, I'm going to stay committed to that. I mean, I am not going everywhere else. I'm not going. I'd rather give that topic and go deep into it than to go broad and try to spread everything so thin that that there's no depth to what I'm talking about. So the commitment to the topic to me is important, because I don't think that it helps as a preacher to present more, and this may be just my concept, than people can digest.
That's true.
I mean, if you give them more, I use the illustration, it's like going into the grocery store with a basket and going down all of these aisles and picking items and putting them in that basket, going up to the counter and, where the cashier rings them up and you pay for them, and then they're still all there on that conveyor, and they say, okay, take them as yours, without a bagger, without any bags, without boxes or anything for you to carry them away with, And so I think that the commitment to structure in sermon preparation, focus on a topic and staying within that topic, is like the bags that help you carry your items away.
Yes. So would you use more than one scripture when you preach topically, or are you principally in one text?
I'm principally committed to one text.
Okay.
And in far too many cases, I guess, not all of that text, because, and for some of us that do a lot of preaching, if you're preaching 3 or 4 5, 6 times a week or something, you know, you have to be kind of sparing with the amount of text that you use, because you want to come back and there's other thoughts in other parts of this text. So, so sometimes, you know, I'm using 2 verses or 3 verses or so, and that's it.
Right, right.
And I'd rather try to give a solid exposition of those, you know, than to work with a longer passage that for me may be, you know, 2 sermons or 4 sermons, you know.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about your sermon preparation method.
Well, my sermon preparation method begins with a proposition. Mm-hmm. You know, the late Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, in his book, The Certain Sound of the Trumpet, which, you know, from the time he wrote that one, I commit myself to reading that one at least once every year. Mm-hmm. And during the time I was teaching, preaching in seminary, you know, probably for every class I taught in preaching, that was, if it was not one of the primary texts, it was on the list. Mm-hmm. But in that, he talks specifically about the development of that proposition. And so what I do is anything that may grab me, whether I'm reading the Bible and there's a passage that, you know, kind of screams, preach me, or if I'm driving down the road and see a billboard or hear some other incident that gives me something from that idea, I attempt to develop a proposition. Mm-hmm. And once I develop that proposition, then I begin to build everything around it to make it into a sermon, hopefully.
Okay.
You know?
So you start with a proposition, and then what's next?
Well, once I develop that proposition, I start to think about resources. You know, I say, hey, you know what? You know, what else am I going to do here? And you know, in my later years, I guess I'm doing a whole lot more from inside in terms of things and experiences that I've had. You know, I used to wonder years ago how so many of our senior pastors could just stand there, you know, and tell story after story, you know, as they made points in their sermons. But I've lived a while now, and I know how because you've lived so many things and so many experiences come. And so I began to just kind of, you know, pray about this and reach out and in my mind and spirit, as well as thinking about, you know, material that I've read, other sermons I've heard, and all the rest that may provide me with inspiration and sermon material. Yes. Then getting to the books, meaning hitting the Bible dictionaries and the commentaries and all the rest, which I usually bring them on late in the process. But I'm writing, you know, I mean, and I still do to a great degree writing with a pen and paper, you know, as opposed to, I do a lot of notes, you know, on my iPad or my computer or my smartphone, but for me, writing it puts it in my mind and spirit in a way that typing it does not do. So I still write quite a bit. So I write down my thoughts and I start to build around that, and I pull material and all the rest, and continue to work on the development of it. So I want to develop that proposition. I want to identify my thesis. I want to identify the antithesis, because I feel like if I don't have the problem or the challenge here, then I don't have a sermon. Right. So because the sermon's got to be about something, correcting something, improving something, developing something. And so I need to know what that antithesis is.
Right.
And so that's where I spend a lot of time. So if I'm getting that antithesis, the thesis, and then I, just lay that out together, and then I move to what Proctor calls the relevant question. Mm-hmm. And once I get there, I'm in there. I'm in the zone, because there I can begin to respond to that question. And this is, of course, another thing that makes it topical, mm-hmm. because that relevant question then is like the engine that guides the rest of that message until I get to a point of resting my case, as we say, like a attorney who's argued mm-hmm. in the courtroom, and all right, and you put it all out there. Now I rest my case. And then, of course, after that is the celebration.
Right. So I want to get to the celebration. One more question I want to ask you before we jump there. So are you manuscript preacher, or?
I preach without notes. I preach from, I guess you could say, from memory. Mm-hmm. I develop it, I write it, I have a manuscript. I don't take it to the pulpit with me. I don't use it. Years ago, I used to take it to the pulpit with me. I mean, it used to be in my Bible. I've never been a manuscript preacher, nor do I use any kind of notes mm-hmm. in the pulpit. Right. I've just never been. I admire preachers who can do that and do it well. While I was president of Vietnamese State Convention of Michigan and the Council of Baptist Pastors of Detroit and vicinity, I also served as dean of our state Congress of Christian Education. And in those positions, I gave annual addresses. Mm-hmm. And so I attempted on those occasions to use a manuscript, I think I did okay, but that was not my zone of comfort. I feel much more comfortable preaching without notes. Right. But of course, my mind is still in that manuscript.
Yes, yes. I call it oral composition.
Okay.
You're composing, and you're not composing ex nihilo out of nothing. Mm-hmm. You're composing out of a manuscript that you've written out and you prayed over. But when you go live, it's just oral composition, and it's the genius of black preaching. And even if you don't have that gift, there's some people that the manuscript, when I preach, I say I'm 75% to the manuscript. I'm going to go with the manuscript, mm-hmm. but 25% of what I say ain't on that manuscript. Mm-hmm. It happens in the moment. So either way, and I think your word to everybody is, we all have different voices, different gifts. Right. Find the way that works for you. Right. And I love the oral composition crowd. I mean, it's being composed, in front of us. I think everybody should use the gift that God gave. I agree with you 100%.
I appreciate you saying that you're 75% manuscript, so 25% of what you say is not on there, because as I age, it's like there's a whole lot more on my manuscript than you will hear me say, because, and I have to write so much more, so it may be 30, 40, 50% more mm-hmm. in there in my manuscript, because I know mm-hmm. I'm going to forget about that much, right. So that I can still do this. So I do lots of writing, and so if I intend to give 3 or 4 points to a sermon, I probably better have 5 or 6 points in my manuscript, because if I forget one, mm-hmm. I don't want it to be obvious. Right. So if I forget one, hey, it's going to be that just recently happened to me, and as a matter of fact, turned out to be the first point. I could not remember for the life of me what it was, but I had another
Right.
point, you know, to
oral composition, you're
yeah,
composing it, right.
you know, so thank you for that oral composition.
Well, you know, and see, and why I stress this is because people think that, you know, you just show up there and that, you know, it's that God gives it to you, and God does give it to you, but you help God with a lot of work.
Yeah, it takes
You know,
work.
a lot of preparation. Let's go to the celebration side. You know, I've said this to you before. You explained to me why I was not a hooper, and at the end of the third C.L. Franklin conference in Detroit, when you were the host and you were closing the conference, you decided to make some remarks. They weren't really planned. At least I didn't think they were. And you were just talking about preaching and talking about C.L. Franklin, and you start talking about hooping. And it was just the most powerful 15 minutes. And you know that I've said to you, you need to write that, you need to publish that. It was just what you know about it. It just flowed out of you. You know, the experience, the years. You said stuff like, it takes 500 sermons. You remember that?
Yeah.
It takes,
yeah.
you know, it takes 500 sermons. So that's about, if you do 50 sermons, that's 10 years
Right.
to really perfect. And you were talking about hooping. And then you said, and you have to be able to understand scales. And if you don't understand scales, you don't understand hooping. So I said, I don't understand scales. So that explains to me why thank you very much for explaining to me why I'm not a hooper. So I just want you to share. You have so much wisdom in this, and experience and depth, and just in that 15 minutes, you were just mesmerizing.
Oh, wow. Well, thank
So,
you. Well, you know, I'll start with that 500 sermon thing, you know, because none of us should think or expect to be the best we can be overnight. You know, it's going to take some work. It's going to take some preaching. It's going to take time and doing it, not just reading about it, sitting in classes on it, hearing others do it. It's going to take some time doing it. 500 sermons is probably what it takes for us to build within ourselves our authentic preaching voice, so that we are totally who we are, so that E.L. Branch is not just a mixture of Samuel DeWitt Proctor and Clarence LaVon Franklin and Elijah Searcy and Wilbur Daniel, you know, and other preachers that I've known and loved and admired, you know, through the years, because the time has to come that E.L. Branch can speak, and that I'm totally me, and that's where I think that 500 sermons preached is about the time that begins to click. And as you say, if you preach 50 sermons a year, and that's a pastor with their own pulpit,
Right.
that gets to do that, and it would take 10 years to accomplish that. You know, some would do it more, you know, who preach revivals and all the rest, but yeah, it's about that, and so the whole thing of developing who you are, whether or not you are gifted to close a sermon in a particular way. If you're going to close a sermon, I mean, and I've heard some of the best sermons without a tune, without a hoop, without a squall, without pulling it, as we say, and so that's not, and I think all of us agree that is not what makes a sermon. That is not what makes preaching. But for us, in the African American church world, it is an integral part of who we are, and it fits in well for us, you know. And I want to say as well that as a quote unquote hooper, I mean, what becomes a challenge for us who are known to be, and especially those of us who are, you know, true hoopers. Now, you know, when you talk about hooper, it's not just a tuner. There's some preachers who can tune, you know, so they can grab a note and they can, you know, they can tune, they can cruise along that note. That's one thing. There are some who can holler. I mean, and holler on a note, and you know they go along and they hit that holler, you know, or whatever it might be, but that's not hooping. Hooping is an art form, and it is based on musical scales. You know, as I was saying, and usually the person who is a hooper is familiar with, and in many cases also gifted as a singer, and who, and though they may not know mechanically and intellectually exactly what they are doing, they know what they are doing when it comes to following, you know, musical tones and that. And to be able to do that at the same time that you are continuously giving a message and saying something of substance, you know, it takes work. And you sacrifice probably a number of good sermons in your efforts to develop that skill, you know. So I had a friend who, I mean, he would tell me, he says, you know, I get my hoop together and then I decide what I'm gonna preach, you know. And hey, he was a tremendous hooper, and he was effective with it. But you know, in most cases, the build up, you know, from the start of that sermon, as you know, I say to preachers, for the preservation of the voice, because sometimes people, you know, want to know, you know, as a hooper, how do you, you know, keep your voice? How do you, you know, preach 4, 5, 6 times in a week and, you know, and still maintain your voice? The voice can do tremendous things if you treat it properly. If you abuse it, then you're going to spend most of your time hoarse or with a sore throat or whatever it may be. But if you start off in conversation tone and only raise your voice minimally as your vocal cords warm, by the time you build to a certain point, your vocal cords are warm and the elasticity of your vocal cords can handle it. It can handle it. You don't need all of the, you know, some want hot water, some want cold water, some want lemons, and some want this or that and the other. You don't need any of that. Your body will do that for you if you treat your voice right. And so to build and to pay attention to that and to prepare the material in your sermon so that if this point requires a lot of energy and effort and passion to express, don't put that early in your sermon, because you're going to overload. You're going to burn yourself out. And many times the crowd is going to go with you. So they're going to take you up there and your voice won't be able to finish that message in many cases. But if you arrange your sermon material so that you're building that crescendo and you're rising, and by the time you get to the celebration, you're ready to go. You know, you're ready to go. And so, you know, and the progress of it, I think many of Reverend Franklin's sermons, and there's others too, you know, Dr. Jasper Williams is probably a great example of, you know, preaching with a sense of skill and who moves through it, you know, methodically, you know, and so forth, and gets to that conclusion, to the end of that sermon at that celebration, and then is able to close in a way that I guess the younger preachers are now saying, you know, shut it down. You know, that's the language used. So you can shut it down at a certain level and do so very comfortably.
So would you say, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not hooping is dead. So what would you say as a part of this discussion? Some think it's dead, some think it's not going to ever die. But
Yeah, well, I think like many things, it has its best seasons, and sometimes sometimes the occasion may not be the most suitable place for hooping, but hooping is alive because it is so ingrained within us and because so many preachers possess the gift. And I think it's a lot of preachers who yet possess the gift who've not yet unearthed it and developed it and put in the time to develop it. I think that lots of preachers who do not hoop would love to.
I think I'm one of those.
Would love to.
Yes.
And but here is a preacher who is known as a hooper who will say to you that one of the drawbacks, if there's, if you could call it a drawback, is that I'm invited places to preach. I'm known as a hooper. If I go to those places to preach and do not hoop, then it will be said that E.L. Branch just talked to us today, or E.L. Branch lectured. Whereas if, because the Holy Spirit may not in every sermon lead us to close in the same way. I consider myself fortunate that I'm invited to so many different events and occasions, and although I'm known as a hooper, I do not have to hoop all the time. I am not one of those anymore but if I'm in revival, I think that's an expectation for me. If they invite me, I think that they want the E.L. Branch that they invited.
As a hooper.
Yeah, as a hooper. But I do everything from service speaker at banquets. I teach, and I lecture and I preach occasions and shall we say in other faith traditions, and I like to be appropriate, and I like to feel that that's okay for me to be appropriate for those occasions. I recently, well, it's been a few years back, preached at a church. I preached there on many occasions, but this was an occasion where the building was being, inducted into the Historical Society to become a historical structure. And so lots of people who were not a part of that particular church were also there for the event. So people of broad variety of faith traditions were there, and so when it was time for me to come in to bring the sermon, I preached, at that church like I always do. I tried to be E.L. Branch, the one that they invited to come, and so when it was over, a white gentleman walked up to me, and he was really excited, and he started shaking my hand, and it was like he was pumping for water. He was just going, he said, that was, and then he said, energetic, He said, so it's about, kind of understanding, what it is, and understanding, how much, in fact, it is a part of the black church preaching tradition, And so often, I mean, I just finished revival this past week, and the people who come up to me and say things like, "You took me back home," or, you know, now that's what I call preaching. You know, I mean, these are the things that people will say, because for so many of them, especially those who are 50, 60, 70 years old, it's what they are familiar with and what they knew growing up and all the rest. And so I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. And as long as there are preachers who are gifted to hoop,
Right.
hooping is going to be around. And
Well, first of all, thank you for telling me it's not too late to become a hooper. So
Yeah.
thank you so
It's
much for
never too
that.
late.
Because I had just about given it all up. You know, matter of fact, I gave it up 10 years ago. 'Cause I just, you know. But so tell me about, do you think with millennials, do you find that, I know with you know, older generations of our age and such, do you think with millennials hooping is still of value or valuable?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is for several reasons. One, I think it is because authenticity is important to millennials. For people to be who they are, and to, you know, just be yourself. I mean, I find it amazing that at this stage in my life, and, you know, with my preaching and the large numbers of folk that I'm blessed to preach to, you know, around this country and beyond, the comments that I receive from not only millennials but from younger generations coming along, that who tap into not only the words of the sermon but also the delivery of the sermon structure and all of the rest. I'm blown away sometimes by it, and I think that millennials want preachers to be who they are and use the gifts that they possess. Yes. The other thing is this, that we, meaning the baby boomers and Generation Xers, project something on to millennials that they, you know, that they're not claiming for themselves. It's just something that's projected on them. The WFX conference, you know, it's held around the country. It's done by church builders, but they focus on worship and everything else that is associated with it, with church life. But one of the things I found particular was that they projected models of church buildings up on the screen and asked those of us present, which was probably mostly baby boomers and Generation Xers, which of these forms of buildings do you think today's worshipers treasure most or find most attractive? And, you know, one was like a building you couldn't tell what it was, but it was a church. It was just a modern structure. Another one was more like a theater kind of thing, you know, and all of that. And then the other was something in between that. And the last one was the old traditional church with a steeple and a cross on the top. I said, now, which one of these would this generation be most attracted to? And of course, the answer was the traditional church. Because for them, that's church. However that came to be, whether it's through the images and icons and emojis, or whether it's...
So tell me, even the younger crowd picked the traditional church?
That's right.
Okay. Okay.
You know, and I mean, I was kind of amazed too. But since that time, you know, I began to understand. I began to understand that a lot of what we, meaning again, baby boomers, project onto millennials is not necessarily what they actually feel and believe themselves. And I think that a lot of it, when it comes to preaching, I think that they are open and they want what they believe, and they can hear truth, it appears, no matter who it comes through. But they want that person to be for real with them and not play acting, want them to be authentic. And I think they receive it very well. As far as I'm concerned, hooping is going to be around, and as long as I'm around and can still do it, it's going to be done. Because I don't know how to print hooping, you know. So I gotta do it verbally.
So you mentioned revivals. So how many revivals do you do a year?
Well, you know, right now I'm probably somewhere between about 12 and 15 revivals a year now. Years ago, I would do a lot more, but of course, years ago, revivals were 5 nights. You know? You know, you preach 5 nights, and sometimes I would do, you know, 3 weeks or 5 weeks, you know, in a row of that kind of preaching, and still preach on Sunday morning. But after becoming president of, you know, these groups, the state convention and the Council of Baptist Pastors in Detroit, you know, it kind of cut down some because of other demands and all the rest, so I could not keep up that kind of a schedule. And so at this point, you know, I just kind of, you know, I kind of, shall we say, discriminate a little bit in terms of what I can do and can't do, because I'm doing, you know, 3 and 4 and 5 services on a Sunday. So, you know, so in so many ways, I do a revival every Sunday morning. You know? So, but it's great. Yeah, it's a part of me. You know, I love it, and when I don't do revivals, I miss it. You know, and it's just part of who I am.
So what do you like about preaching revivals?
Well, I love it. I love the night after night experience with the people of God. I also enjoy, you know, being with different congregations in different places in different cities and all the rest. Even though I've probably done more revivals in the city I live in than, you know, I think probably anybody else that lives in the city, and I, you know, appreciate that. Appreciate, you know, pastors who think enough of me to invite me to come, but it's special. Revivals are special because of their focus, because it's about spiritual renewal and restoration. It's about evangelism and outreach. You know, it's about focus on church life and spiritual life, and it's plenty of things to preach about in those areas. You know, so that's, and then, you know, revival sermons are you know, are geared around those particular elements. And once you start to develop those sermons around those, you have plenty in supply. So I love it.
So that leads me to think that a revival sermon has a form.
Oh yeah.
So what would you identify as the form of the revival sermon that might be different than the Sunday morning sermon, though it may be the same? I'm just exploring with you.
Well, probably, I guess for me, the difference is the focus, and it's also something that, you know, is taken from one place to another, so that you can share this with numbers of congregations. Sunday morning preaching, you know, with people that in my case, you know, people I've been preaching to for years, you know, and many of which I know their stories. I know of life incidents and experiences with lots of the people and their families on Sunday morning, and so it's more pastoral on Sunday morning than revival is. In revival, you can be a bit more open in preaching, meaning you're not likely to be preaching to people that you just counseled with, so that you're sensitive to information that may appear to be divulging some of those concerns, and so you're freer to express things and to share. You know, so if I'm in San Bernardino, California, you know, then I can preach there in a way that speaks to a more general concern and need for congregations and individuals for spiritual renewal, growth, development, and commitment, and all the rest.
So one of my suspicions is that revival sermons tend to be deliverance sermons. I mean, that's just my suspicion. So you can confirm, or that the corpus would include the three Hebrew boys, you know, delivered from the fiery furnace, Paul and Silas in jail delivered. And that's not all it is, but I'm trying to identify the sermonic form, the forms of sermon that reside in a revival environment. Mm-hmm. And one I noticed is the deliverance sermon. Mm-hmm. So would you agree with me on that?
I agree that many revivalists do indeed focus on that or similar. Okay. And I think that that's important to a certain degree, the part of it. I have discovered, and really do believe in my spirit, that revival preaching could and should focus on the individual's need for spiritual renewal, sometimes for self-examination, to heighten their own personal commitment to God, to ministry, to their local congregations, and to service, you know. And so what I attempt to do in revivals is to think in terms of theme so if I'm going to be preaching next week in revival, I will probably say one of those nights would be centered around worship, helping people identify for themselves those kind of things that's going to assist them in having a true worship experience. Mm-hmm. Okay, one of those nights should center around fellowship, which is the connections that people ought to have with each other, right. and all that. And then maybe one of those nights, and I often will center around stewardship.
Okay, gotcha.
You know, and then another night will center around discipleship. You know, and so that I'm not coming each night with the same theme. You know, so that and then the selection of passages of Scripture, you know, could fit in those areas. You know, recent revival, case in point, I one night talked about spiritual renewal through worship. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that if we are talking about, you know, recharging our spiritual batteries like we do the batteries on our cell phone and like you do on your car, you know, you know, we need to have our times of renewal. You know, Dr. Proctor called it spiritual fatigue. Mm-hmm. You know, and the reason that a lot of people just kind of burn out and are worn out and used up, and we aren't going to move ministry forward with lots of people in that category. So we focus on that at least one night, and so that the altar prayer, if there's one, and the Bible readings and all the rest can center in on that, so that at least on that night of revival, people can kind of gauge their own spiritual batteries, you know, and see where they are. And if they see that they are running low, that they can do what needs to be done to get boost, so that it ain't all about Daniel in the lion's den and the Hebrew boys in the fire furnace, which that's good too, because many people are going to need that. Right. But that's one night, you know what I'm saying? But not every.
Thank you so much. Thank you for opening that up and helping me and helping all of our viewers to kind of see the kind of thinking and prayer and love for the church and love for God that goes into all preaching, right? A particular kind. And so in all these years of preaching, do you have a favorite sermon?
I do. I think there are sermons that, kind of stand out in different time periods and depend upon what's going on and so forth like that. But one of the sermons that I think I would consider my favorite is the one I call Cleaning Up the Jericho Road.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it.
Well, there's a broken brother laying on the road, And the thing about it for me is that that sermon tends to challenge the conviction of any believer in terms of how is your faith worked out in practical behavior and actions and in service to humankind. To be religious and to be churchy and to do nothing of essence or meaning or value is futile. And so that's what that sermon does for me. It zeroes in on, okay, now let's see what we gonna do. We see and hear what the priest did and what the Levite did. Let's see what you're gonna do and what I'm going to do. And whatever we do, let's identify what motivates us to do that. That's it. And of course the key to it to me is that after we pick up people who've been beaten up on the Jericho Road, we aren't finished until we do something to alleviate the problem on the Jericho Road. Because to keep picking people up without challenging the forces that are beating them up and leaving them there broken in the first place is spiritually irresponsible, And so, and so I invite, at the end of that, I invite people to come join the cleanup crew. And I tell them the whole list of folk from Micah and Isaiah and Amos, who was on the cleanup crew, and the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm, all of them were on the cleanup crew, and that Jesus was on the cleanup crew. And so when you join the cleanup crew, you'll be in good company as we clean up the Jericho roads of our time.
Well, thank you for just a marvelous interview, for your generosity of time and energy, and I'm really appreciative. And I want to give you anything that you want to say that I missed, anything that's on your heart to say. We could have asked it all, or it's such an inexhaustible subject. I always at least like to leave.
Well, I mean, if you give me a moment to say what I want to say, I just really would have to use that moment to commend you because of the work that you are doing and because of what you've brought to preaching, and you express your gratitude for my coming here, but I'm overwhelmingly grateful for just being invited to sit with you, who has represented preaching for so many years and have done it well and will continue to do it well, and for what you're doing in this area of black preaching and continuing through this PhD program to kind of secure it for the future. And so that's what I'm gonna take my time to do, is to commend you and encourage you and to say, whatever I could do to be helpful to you, from here forward, I'm at your disposal.
Well, thank you for that, sir. It's we have been given this gift of a tradition. It has been passed on to us. L.K. Curry's, Frederick Sampson's, Prathia Hall, C.L. Franklin. This has been passed to us. And I think that we have to, and I know you agree, we're really talking to the choir, to honor it, to value it, to, for me, write it up so that it doesn't go away, to archive it, and to raise a generation of scholars who will be committed to keeping the tradition. So what I hope is there'll be 25, under my watch, PhDs who go into the world to teach, uphold, write about, explore, keep it going, because it's not just, what we've done up to this point. It's got to change, evolve in a connection with what's already been. When you disconnect the new stuff from what's already been, then you're out there by yourself. But to this lineage, and we still have some of the same racial hatred, segregation, some of the same stuff that the black church has always been dealing with. And it's amazing to see how long this tradition has been and what it has done and what it will do in the future. So it's crazy, but I just thank God for making me a black preacher. I mean, it's just a beautiful,
absolutely.
It's a beautiful tradition. It's just, I'm so grateful for it. And I know that we had to suffer, and you don't get there without a lot of stuff that we had to go through. But
there's an old joke where a guy asked the preacher, said, "Well, if you wasn't a preacher, what would you be?" And he said, "Why, I'd be ashamed of myself."
Thanks so much, and you keep up just the great work, and I'm gonna keep saying, you man, write that stuff down.
I'm doing my best at it, So I'm making notes, I'm doing things, and we're gonna pull it all together at some point.
Because what you know is genius. It's just what you know. Even the little bit that you've been able to articulate to us in these few minutes, the depth of thought, the creativity, the way to put it together, to be able to explain it to somebody else. I just want to support you, anything I can do to help you with that, because so much of our genius goes to the grave with our preachers, and you've got so much genius. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
All right, bless you.
Bless you so much.